Hello and welcome back to CxReports. Today we'll go through the parameters of CxReports, what are they and how they're useful to you. So let's dive in. This is where we left off last time, finishing off this report and making it reusable with this JSON data source. And the JSON data source here allows us to generate different PDFs every time when we prepare the same structure with different data and send it beforehand to CxReports or with the request to get a new PDF. The problem with that is every time you wish to generate a new PDF, you have to prepare the whole data source. But in this case, for example, when it's an invoice report, everything related to this report is connected to an invoice number. So why not have a single number, a single parameter with the invoice number as an input for your report instead of the whole data source, and then let CxReports fetch everything else needed for this report on its own once the generation process starts. So this is why parameters can be very useful. Let's start by setting the parameter, a brand new parameter, and let's call this one the invoice number. So under the reports tab of CxReports, we're going to go to the parameters and we're going to add a new parameter. We're going to name and this parameter, and the name is important because this is how we're going to access the parameter. So let's call it invoice number. We're going to assign to the parameter group. Usually you're going to have one. In this case, I don't. So I'm going to set up a new parameter group, which is in here. Let's call it a default. And let's add our parameter. Now this is going to be required and we're going to display this value. For now, let's call it a text parameter. And that's all we need. We're going to save it and we're going to close this. Now you're going to see that our report has disappeared and we have a button here as well as in here, which says now we need to set parameters. This is because a required parameter of the report is now empty. So we need to set a value. So let's say 1, 2, 3, 4. We have the report, but no data has been consumed. Now, if you check Data Explorer, which is a new section in our application, you can see that now we have a new section in here, which is a $param section. And inside there, you're going to see that we have an invoice number with a value 1, 2, 3, and 4. So instead of consuming this value from the data source, we can now consume it directly from the parameter, which is in here, invoice number. And you can see in here that the template says invoice number, data, invoice, and invoice number. Instead of that, we're going to use $params and then invoice number. And now we are consuming it. Now, if you like to change this, you can go to set parameters and add a different number in here, which will be automatically applied to the report. That's one of the parameters we offer. Others are a number, a switch, which is basically a true and a false value, a lookup, which is the most complicated one, date, month range, and a JSON, which is just an option to set up a really complex nested parameters if you have a need for that. We can go through a couple of them during this tutorial. So let's see, for here we have a issue date, which is, let's say, from the 1st to the 2nd, issue date and due date. So we can parameterize some of those values, or maybe you would like to set a new parameter or a new value in here, where to say the date of the invoice. So not only the issue date and due date, but maybe the date it was printed on, or maybe add a footer on day when it was sent. So let's add a new parameter to this report, and let's call it a date parameter. Let's call it print date, just as an example. It's also going to be required, but we're not going to display this value, and let's say it's today. So now we have an option to use this parameter somewhere inside of our report. So we can do it on the very bottom of the report. If we remove this picture that we tested, we can add a spacer, expand the spacer to take all of the empty space, and then at the very bottom of the here we can add on date, and then go to params dot, and you can say the print date, and you have a date in here. Now you can format this as well. So instead of leaving it as a default format, we can add a date. Let's say the date as a D, colon D. And now we are formatting in the local date format. Why is this useful for me? Why is it better to send multiple data points to the application or the generation process instead of sending everything inside of one big data source? Well, sometimes you don't want to send everything. Maybe for you, it's easier to integrate with your application with only sending just an invoice ID and getting the whole invoice from CxReports based on the invoice ID. The way how you can do this is use parameters as an entry point for the report, and then let the report fetch the data for the specific invoice ID with data sources. And I'm going to show you that example in a little bit. For now, I'm going to go to the Postman and show you how to consume these parameters that we set up in here from the Postman library. From the Postman and how to integrate that in your application. So in here, I have a report. This is just a link for fetching the PDF version of our report with proper authorization, and I'm getting the report. Now in here, I have no invoice number at the moment because I'm not sending any parameters, and we changed in here the value specifically to consume invoice number, which has no default value at the moment. So how to do this is we're going to add a new parameter, query parameter. We're going to call it params because that's the key for it, and then the value. Value can be encoded JSON with key and value for every specific parameter, or it can be a plain JSON. So I'm going to use a plain JSON option here. I have an invoice number with number 14 and have a print date of 10th of July. So I'm going to send a new request for PDF, and I'm getting an invoice number 14 with a date of 7th of July. So 10th of July, sorry. So this is all good and well. What else can we do with parameters? So we can add, for example, one more parameter, or we can get rid of this one. It's not really useful. And we can add a new one, which we can call a disclaimer page, where you can control if you want to show or hide a page on the report. So we're going to call this disclaimer, same group, it's not required, and it's a switch. So let's add a new page to the report, and let's add a text component in here, and let's call this is some. Okay, now when you fetch a report from Postman with the, this is not needed anymore. You're going to see a page number 1, which is the same as it was before, but now we have a page number 2 in here, which is a disclaimer page. Now we don't really want to show all the time this, maybe only in specific scenarios. So how to bind our new parameter in here to show or hide this page? Actually, I'm going to rename it to, so the label to be show disclaimer page. So how to consume it? Well, you can go to the page number 2, which we call disclaimer. We can go to the page tab of this specific page and then set the page visibility expression, which is also consuming parameters. So in here, you can say $params and then disclaimer. Because this is a Boolean value, this will be resolved into true or the false, and it will show or hide the page. Now, how you can be sure it's working? If you turn it off, you can see that it gets a little bit of a the opacity drops for this specific page. And if you do a preview in here, you can see that now we only have one page, and you can turn on this parameter and you can see the page is now displayed. And the same goes when you're controlling it from the Postman. So you can here, you can say disclaimer and then true. Now you get a new report with the disclaimer page here, or you can set it to false. And there's no disclaimer page. So this is just one of many options how you can use parameters to interact and control the report. Now, what else can be done with parameters? Well, one of the more useful and more complicated parameters is the lookup parameter or the drop-down value. So we can go to the parameters section and add a new parameter, and let's call it the employee. And then under the options for the type, we're going to select the lookup option. I'm going to assign it to the default group. Now, regarding source, the lookup or the drop down can be sourced, the values can be sourced directly or hard-coded in the parameter itself. They can be fetched from the API, a SQL database, Mongo, or Google Sheets. They can be also JSON parameter value. So let's say we hard-code the employees and we're gonna add 2 employees, John and Jane. So for the ID, we're gonna say 1 John, and for the 2 Jane. Usually every option has a unique ID, which is not really human readable, but it's unique to the selection option, and the name that's usually human readable, but not really unique or useful for some advanced queries. So that's why we separate those two. And then the name of the parameter should usually reflect the option that you selected, but the saved value for the option is going to be the ID always. So we're going to call this employee ID. And we're going to save this just to show you how it works. Go to set parameters window, and in here you have the employee or the employee John or Jane. So let's say the employee Jane, and we apply. So in here, I'm just gonna leave the name like this. But for the data explorer, when you open it now and you open the parameters, you can see in here that now we have 2 new options, the employee ID and the employee display text. Now display text is just a side effect of selecting a lookup field value. This is the important one that we're going to focus on. It is the employee number 2. Now we can use this in other queries or other parameters and fetch the data specifically for this parameter, for this employee. Now, in order to give you a better understanding of how to connect parameters and data sources, I'm going to go to a different workspace where we have a database setup for the AdventureWorks. And I'm going to go to the invoice, and I'm going to show you how we set up parameters and data sources in connection. So for the parameters, you can see in here that we have an invoice number, and this is a lookup of many invoice numbers. And if I go to the report section, parameters, and I open this parameter, you're going to see that this in here is a lookup with a SQL source, connected database. In this case, we have one added, and then the query which returns our values. Now, for this specific example, we're only fetching the IDs, and we're setting the value and the display field to that specific ID. This is what is happening in here. Every time you open this, you have a new option. How is this useful? Well, if I change one of these parameters, let's say to a different option in here, everything inside of the report changes. So this is the perfect example of how when you set up only one parameter, in this case the invoice ID, which is unique for this report or for this invoice, everything else changes inside the report. And this is achieved with connection between the parameters, in this case the invoice ID parameter, and the data sources. So This is just an old version of the data source, but we have two new data sources in here, which are both SQL data sources. And you can see in here, it's a very complicated query, but the most important part for this video and this lesson is this here, where we are saying the sales order ID is equals to @sales order ID. And then our algorithm detects that you want to use a parameter into your SQL query, and we say, okay, I see that we have a Salesforce ID as a parameter. To which specific parameter I should map this value? And then we say, okay, this map specifically to the params invoice ID, which is the name of the invoice parameter. And it is required, which means that this query will never run without this parameter being set. So this gives us an ability. If you go to the Data Explorer, you can see that invoice ID is a number, which is set from the option, from the lookup option. And then we have the details, or the invoice header and details, which we fetch specifically for this invoice ID. So if I change in here, you see that order dates, due date, shipping and billing address, etc. If I change this to a different invoice in here, all the IDs are rerun. And now in the Data Explorer, we have new details with more options and a different header option. I would also like to tell you the difference between two parameter types, date and month range. So one is used when you have a specific date that you would like to show in a report, or when the data relies on one or more specific dates, which are start of the month, middle of the month, and is the in between. So I'm going to go to parameters, and I'm going to add a new parameter type of date, and I'm going to call it date param. And I'm going to save this. So when I go back to here and I select the date, you can see that specifically the date we selected is going to be shown in the Data Explorer like a date. If you need to specify a range, for example, first and last day for which the data should be showed, you can do that with specifying another date. So this one can be called date from, and the other one can be date to, with also a date parameter. So now you have two dates which you can set and use inside of your report. And if I set, for example, this to be first and this to be last day of the month, and I go to Data Explorer, you can see the date from is set correctly and date to as well. So this is perfect. But if you do not have a need for a really specific date, like from the 5th of the month or something like that until the 21st of the month. So if your range generally includes at least a month, and it can expand to more, in that case you can use a second component, a second parameter type that we have, and that would be a month range. So in here I'm going to say this is a range as a name, and I'm going to set up a month range as a type. Set parameters, now we have a range. So in here, when you click and select a date, you have a calendar as an option. For a range, it's a bit different. You have at least a month, which you can click like one or more months, for example, like February. And if you apply this and go to Data Explorer, you can see that these are dual dates, date from and date to, and the range is actually not the one single value, but it's an object with two keys, from and to, and corresponding dates. Now you can see in here we selected the February, which means that the start is going to be the 1st of February, and the end in this case is 1st of March. Now this is because that's how the data has been set up for this specific parameter, but you can also turn on this option, which will then apply the configuration when you select a parameter, for example, the February, and apply the data. You can see in the Data Explorer that it goes from the 1st until the last day of the month for the selected month. You can also select more than a month. You can select by clicking and holding 1, 2, 3 months, 6 months, however many you like. You can also select a full quarter, so Q1, Q2, Q3, or Q4, or just drag it. You can go between years if you do a selection. You can also select a full year with a single click. So and from the January until December of 2024, and apply this. And because data is including the last day, is going to show from the 1st of January until the 31st of December of the year you specified. The last thing I would like to show you is an option to specify global parameters. Now, what are those? Let's take this example from the demo server, where if you go to the parameters and you check in here that we have a query that we wrote for this specific lookup, imagine you have multiple of these reports which are using the same parameters. Now you have to rewrite this query every time or copy and paste it. But what happens if if you need to change it? Now, instead of one place, you have to change it on every single report. Or what happens if you have a specific parameter, which for that workspace that you're working on, should be applied to all the reports, or for example, to all the reports of a single type. Now, all of these would require you to copy and paste these local parameters every single time. And then in case of changes, you have to update all the reports, which is not practical. So instead of that, we have an option to specify the global definitions and then use those definitions inside of the report parameters. Now for this, I'm going to go back to our local server and I'm going to show you how to move a parameter definition, in this case the employee ID, which has these values hard-coded at the moment, how to move it to one place and then consume it across reports. So I'm going to delete it from here because I do not really want to use it here. And I'm going to go outside to the parameter section here, where I have parameter groups, which we set up earlier. And then we have reusable parameters and global parameters. Difference is reusable parameters are just the definitions. And you can use those definitions in reports where you would like to use them, while global parameters will be set on the workspace level for every report. So for the reusable parameter, I'm going to go in here. I'm going to say the label is going to be employee. The type is going to be a lookup. And the values, well, they're going to be hard-coded. So let's say 1 John and 2 Jane. Now I'm going to save this. I'm going to go back to the report, to the parameters, add a new parameter. I'm going to call it employee ID, just as I did before. Same parameter group, but for the parameter, I'm going to use existing parameter and I'm going to use employee. This is the global definition that we have. Save and then close. Now in the window, I have the same thing. Employee, John or Jane. If I go to Data Explorer, you're going to see that the ID is saved correctly. Let's say I have a different report. Second report with an invoice type. Let's say I have to use the parameters. I'm going to add just a one page in here. Let's say I have to use the parameter again. So employee ID again, group, use existing in this case, and then say employee again. And now in my parameters, I have the same options. If I go back to the global definition, in case something changes, we have to add a third option in here, mark. Now all my definitions are going to be updated, or they're going to consume the one that we have globally. And you can see that we have now mark in all the reports. Now, what happens if you have a global parameter? So you need to use one parameter across the all of your reports. You do not want to add every time the employee ID as a parameter, or let's say the company ID, which can be a global parameter. You can go in here and add a new parameter. I'm going to call it company ID. Required, not really. Let's say I'll look up again with the value 1, and let's say adventure, and let's say option 2 boring company. I'm just going to save it like this as a global parameter, so company ID. Now when you go to the parameters, you're going to see this company ID automatically on all of the set parameter windows, even though it's not in here. You can apply the value and you can check in your data explorer that the value is actually saved. So company ID is in here, but this parameter is not on the report level, it's on a global level. And again, the invoice is going to have it again in here. And that's how you can set up global parameters. Now let's say I have a different report type. So we go to report types, I add a different one, we call it miscellaneous. And we change the second report type from invoice to miscellaneous. Now, if you go in here, you're going to see that we still have this company in here, company parameter. But now, if I go to my parameters and global parameters and update the definition of this parameter to only apply to invoice reports and save it, you can see that my first invoice, which is actually an invoice, is going to have a company ID in here, which you can apply, but the second report is not going to have a company ID because this is of a different type. So this is how you can control global parameters on report type level. Thank you for joining us. Report parameters are a powerful tool how you can control and interact with your report and control it from outside with only defining a couple of parameters as an input section of your report. Now with parameters, you can combine them, you can do multiple different things with them. So I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions. You can always reach out for us or check the documentation for more complicated and advanced examples, which I'm sure we're going to publish even more explanations in the future. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.